and then deposit currency that we have sitting in our accounts in banks that circulates by check, wire transfer, and plastic card. M3 encompasses basically all of that currency, and the issue that's happening is M3 is growing more rapidly than economic activity. One of the reasons why gold has emerged as money over thousands of years is that this above-ground stock of gold grows very consistently. It grows by approximately 1.7% per annum. Every year it gets 1.7% larger. And that's approximately equal to new wealth creation and also approximately equal to world population growth. So you have this consistency in gold's purchasing power. So I can, look today and see that an ounce of gold buys the same amount, the same barrels of crude oil that it did 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Or an ounce of gold today buys a Colt 45 handgun, which is what it took to buy a Colt 45 handgun in the Wild West back in the 1880s. And they also say an ounce of gold today buys a good man's suit. An ounce of gold in Roman times bought a good toga for a Roman senator. So you have this above-ground stock of gold growing by approximately the same as new wealth creation and world population growth. So you have this consistency. Whereas the money that's created by government, M3, dollars and even the other currencies, there is no consistency to the growth rate. Recently we saw M3 growing as rapidly as 19% per annum. This was last year. And over the past year, it's gone down to about 1.5% per annum. So this volatility in M3 growth basically makes the currency less effective because the purchasing power of the currency can change very dramatically by just changing the growth in M3. Now, that's one half of the equation. These M's, M1, M2, M3, these deal with the quantity of currency in circulation. But as we know, price is a function of supply and demand. So it's the demand for dollars that are also important in order to determine, the dollar's price. Or when we talk about money, we mean purchasing power, not price. So the purchasing power of the dollar is a function of both supply and demand. And the problem that the dollar is facing now is that the demand for the dollar is falling dramatically around the world. We see this all of the time. Central banks diversifying out of the dollar, central banks buying gold, individuals buying gold, diversifying out of the dollar to minimize dollar holdings. So the dollar is losing purchasing power, even though M3 growth rates have been declining over the past year.
Why do you think it is that the average public has a perception of owning gold as risky and sees it as potential confiscation, like it's something that can be confiscated, so since it was done in the past, don't get involved with it now? And yet, at the same time, the average person feels seemingly very comfortable having U.S. dollars in banks, even though there's a decree by the G20 and leaders of the world that they want to get rid of the dollar. What is that about?
Yeah, it's really crazy, isn't it? There's no logic to it. It's all emotion. For 100 years, governments have been at war with gold. Up until 1914, national currencies were on the classical gold standard. And under the classical gold standard, which was invented by Sir Isaac Newton in 1700.
I didn't know that. I don't think the public knows that.
Yeah, he invented it. It's actually an interesting story. The Bank of England was established in 1694. Again, this was an advancement in the form of currency. Instead of using silver coin, which was the coin of the realm in Britain at the time, the Bank of England said, keep the coin in the vault, and we'll use these banknotes, pieces of paper, cash currency instead, and let that circulate as currency instead of coin. Well, it was a good idea because it was a more efficient form of currency. And the first bank crisis occurred 2 years later in 1696 when the Bank of England had issued too much paper relative to the amount of currency in circulation. Now, at the time, this is when John Locke, for example, wrote his treatise on silver and commented on the debasement of the currency that was being pursued by the Bank of England. But at the time, King William did not have, the finances of the crown were very poor. He was fighting wars against France. The Stuarts monarchy had just been overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, so he was still worried about being usurped by the possible, stewards, or what they called pretenders to the throne. So he was strapped for cash, and the Bank of England basically came up with a way of financing the wars and the money that he needed in exchange for the royal charter that was given to the Bank of England. But the monetary turmoil that was created by the banking crisis in 1696 had King William perplexed. So he turned to the brightest mind of the day, Sir Isaac Newton, and said, figure this all out. And what Newton did is he essentially created the rules of the classical gold standard, turned Britain into a gold standard-based economy, and the British pound, which is basically another way of saying gold, reigned supreme for 214 years until 1914. So it was a complementary relationship between gold and national currencies under the classical gold standard. And what central banks did under the classical gold standard is they managed the currency in order to make certain that a pound always had the purchasing power of gold at the weight that it was defined. One British pound was 0.2435 ounces of gold. And so it was. So a pound in 1914 had essentially the same purchasing power that a British pound did in 1700 in terms of buying, bushels of wheat or commodities and things of that nature. So, the classical gold standard was a complementary relationship. But, getting to where we are now and where we've been really for the last 100 years, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, governments and central banks realized that they didn't have to follow Newton's rules, which were voluntary. And if they could control gold and move away from the gold standard, they could create fiat money and create as much money as they wanted out of thin air in order to pursue their objectives. The way I put it is that, governments need power, they therefore need guns, but they can't create guns out of thin air, so they create fiat money out of thin air to buy guns. And that's basically the system that we've had for the past 100 years. And gold plays a key element of that, because gold is really the natural form of money, and if you can suppress the price of gold, you make fiat currencies look better. Anyway, from 1914 to the present, instead of having a complementary relationship between gold and national currencies, it's been a competitive relationship. Then governments have been trying to, fight gold and keep gold controlled to make national currencies look better. But we've reached a stage where I think that essentially, despite all of the government propaganda, which is why people think gold is risky, despite all of the government propaganda and the power, we've reached a stage where I think the end of the dollar is within sight. National currencies are probably going to collapse if the dollar collapses, and we're going to go back to a new system. Now, the people that brought us the fiat currencies and the unconstitutional dollar system that we now have are going to probably try to bring in more fiat currencies at a supranational level, like the euro in Europe, or like rumors have been talked about the Amero in the United States, Canada, and Mexico for a North American currency to compete with the euro. But the question is whether or not the American people, Canadian people, and the Mexican people allow that to happen.
I understand this morning from your free GoldMoney report that the euro is in trouble and spiraling out of control. Can you explain that?
Yeah, right now, most of the currencies of the world are backed by U.S. dollars. Most bank reserves today are not gold. Most bank reserves today are U.S. dollars. And that's particularly true for the euro. So if the U.S. dollar collapses and goes into a black hole, the gravitational pull will pull other currencies along with it, unless those currencies get rid of the dollars as reserves and back their currencies by gold or silver.
Do you think that's possible?
That the dollar is going to go in the black hole? Yeah.
Whatever new currency evolves or is put into place can or will be backed by gold or silver.
Well, what my hope is that, and what we aim to do in GoldMoney, is to give people the opportunity to transact in gold outside of national currency systems. So you can completely avoid fiat currency and just transact in gold or in silver.
There's this psychology for most people that, A, if you buy gold, you should have it with you. B, there's a lot of people that still think leveraging gold in ETFs and buying contracts for gold is the same, which you stated clearly in your book, it is not. But the other thing is there is this psychology that if the gold is stored away from